This case was sent to the Environmental Board by the Planning Commission on March 10th. The Environmental Board heard the case at the regularly scheduled meeting of April 4th. After public testimony, the board voted to postpone the case so that the city staff from Environmental Resource Management could visit the property and conduct an on-site inspection. The city has performed that on-site inspection of the property, and they have prepared a written environmental assessment, which is in your backup. And that concludes my brief presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have about zoning.
There was a statement made that was an environmental assessment, and I just want to clarify that's not environmental assessment. It's just a compilation of some existing data. And I just want to be real careful to say, I don't want to present that as an environmental assessment.
Right, and that's good.
An analogy would be to, like, would say that a shopping list is actually going shopping. So I just want to make that clear.
Thank you. We have no questions about zoning, but we do have about the environmental conditions.
Could you give us the history about this particular case? Has it gone in front of the Zoning Planning Commission?
No, it was, as I stated earlier, it went to the Planning Commission on March 10th, and the Planning Commission voted to send it to the Environmental Board for your input. I surmise, there's no environmental variances, so I surmise that it was for the input by this board in reference to could the property be developed and would there be any environmental reasons that it should not be developed for residential use.
So they're waiting for our recommendation?
That's correct.
Could you give me, just in very general terms, what type of criteria, particularly the criteria that would be relevant to our board in determining whether this zoning change is appropriate?
Well, from a standpoint of what we do in the city of Austin, we have what we call the order of process. It is zoning, subdivision, site plan, building permit. It's just recommended for residential. That's residential that's surrounding it on all four sides.
So then, is it my understanding that staff hasn't really looked at maybe the environmental impacts in making their recommendation here?
No, like I say, in the order of process, that particular aspect of what the city is looking for is addressed at a different stage, not at zoning.
Okay, thank you.
It seems to me that recommending a property for zoning one way or the other, that the environmental assessment would be an important part of that process. But it most definitely comes after the zoning decision is made and once the site plan is put together.
That's correct.
My opinion is that it would be an important component of recommending zoning options one way or the other.
I think it's important to point out that that's just a summary of the environmental conditions that we observed. Is not an official environmental assessment. It's not an official geologic assessment. It's just merely our observations and the public information available on the geology and our interpretation of the topography on the site. Starting off, as you know, the site is 12.45 acres. It is in the Travis County subdivision. It's currently undeveloped. It is kind of a natural area used by the neighborhood. It has a number of hiking trails and benches through it. The site is in the Barton Creek watershed. There are two drainages that leave the site, so all the surface water flow flows to Barton Creek. Our own dye trace studies of this area indicate that the groundwater in this area, when it recharges, actually flows to the Cold Springs watershed. In those kind of cursory reviews of the site, we found several, I'm going to call them features of interest. They're just small depressional areas. We did not excavate them. We did not determine if they were really significant karst features or not, because that typically doesn't occur at this point in the process. Karst features become clogged all the time, so you could have a big clay layer in a significant feature, and it just wouldn't show any indication of rapid recharge. And that's why we always say, when in doubt, dig them out. The next slide kind of shows the site is in red. The dark green and the pink show the critical water quality zone. As you can see, part of the property contains what's called water quality transition zone. And basically in that area, you can't really have much development. Then the next slide kind of shows these features of interest that we found. The ones I've located are in red. And you can see that Mr. Howard and I found some of the same features and there's some that he saw that I didn't come across. But basically, they're all kind of these closed depressions. Basically, we're concerned about, potential karst features. Recharge features are just, they're not clear-cut like springs and rim rocks and bluffs, There's a subsurface component, and really the best way to investigate those is to dig them out.
Groundwater flow, you said that dye traces from area recharge features indicate that it goes to Cold Springs. Would you describe where Cold Springs is?
Okay, it's on Lady Bird Lake or Town Lake. Huh?
It's just right up there.
It's just up there.
Yeah.
What I usually do is I get in above the Mopac Bridge, and you paddle about half the distance up the lake, and on the south side of the bank, basically there's a kind of horizon where numerous little orifices come out. There's one good one that we call Cold Springs.
I'm looking at the map that you have with the red dots and the gold dots.
Yes, ma'am.
And it indicates there's lots of features of interest there.
To me, that's significant because you're talking about dye trace showing up.
Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry, that is a typo. It should be Travis Country, and this is near the site we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
There's sufficient space to be able to develop the property.
Well, basically what happens is we determine the setbacks, and you're allowed up to 15%. If by building setbacks or CF setbacks you get less, you get less. And I guess the city standpoint would be that, you might have 1,000 square feet. Well, you can build one house on your 12 acres then.
We're premature because the final resolution is not rendered until a full environmental assessment is made. Is that correct?
Any building setbacks, any easements, all that gets counted against your impervious cover.
And it was not our staff's purview to be able to identify CEFs at this point.
At this point in the process.
I want to make that clear.
That's right. That's right.
It seems to me that there's a disconnect between having the environmental assessment done at the tail end of the process after the land is purchased with the intent to develop it in a certain way and a site plan is developed and then you do an environmental assessment. Why wouldn't you find out about critical environmental features prior to all of this?
I think it's Chuck Lesniak, Watershed Protection. That's a reasonable question. Zoning is just about appropriate use for the land as a whole. There is potentially there's an environmental component to that. I think you're right.
Environmental features identified on particular parcels of land could help dictate what's a more reasonable use for that land and therefore a more reasonable zoning.
But right now the assumption is, there's a pretty large fault. It has about 100 foot of offset. And so as the faults are grinding up, they act as good pathways for water flow, typically.
There are no environmental features currently present, as observed by the city staff.
The way I read the report, it does not say that there are not critical environmental features. They did not say that there are not critical environmental features on that property.
That's correct. That's correct.
Thank you, Dr. Maswell. I'm Zoila Vega with the Austin Heritage Tree Foundation. I'd like to speak first about the trees. I'm not an arborist, but I've been leading the foundation for 3 years looking at trees in sites. So with all due respect to the city arborist, Keith Mars, our environmental reviewer, it's very hard to evaluate trees when you walk in a 12-acre land and you don't have a guide. So I disagree with the amount of ash junipers that he estimated. He said 80%. I think it's a little bit less than that, maybe 60, 65, not that much ash juniper. Keith also mentioned that there were at least 5, at most 5 protected trees and 5 heritage trees. I saw much more than that, at least 10. The heritage trees and at least 10 of the protected trees. He talked about invasives. Actually, in this site, I didn't see that many invasives. It was surprising. There were some ligustrum, but not like other sites. So I really like the land. I think it's in a, not pristine, but very close to a pristine location. The species post oaks are very rare in Austin, and this place had many post oaks that were of a good size. The reference to many trees that were dead, there were not that many, but there were some trees that were dead, and it's obviously because of drought, because the soils are very shallow. Everywhere you look, you can see the rocks, porous rock on the ground, because it's over the aquifer. Now, besides the issues with trees, What really caught my attention was all the environmental features in the land, how beautiful the land is and how much it deserves to be preserved. The environmental features, you can see there's depressions. To me, they look like sinkholes. It's a matter of excavating. We have an expert, Dr. Howard, saying that there's a high likelihood that there's caves underneath. I talked to Dr. Howard myself. When I started talking to Dr. Howard, from then I talked to Ed Peacock from Watershed, asking him how difficult will it be to excavate these caves. He said, not a big deal. Well, the process is all upside down. We see the same thing with trees. Tree surveys are not done until the zoning is done. When the zoning is changed, that seals the fate of the trees because of the density on the land. It's very hard for the environmental reviewer to save any more trees other than the protected with alter protection from the Heritage Tree Ordinance once there's a zoning change for the land. The same applies for this. If that's what needs to be changed and you need to investigate more to really make sure that there's a cave, then that's what needs to happen. But I see it's a community of neighbors that really cares for the environment and have done beyond what most people will do to try to save it. So, the potential of the land. I imagine this land like a research place, same as the neighbors do, where they already have the money and the commitment for the Natives Prairie Association. If you combine that with research for caves, it can be a wonderful educational place. I heard that zoning is not about the environment. However, when the Planning Commission gets their backup to determine the zoning, Watershed makes a recommendation about the environmental features. It's just that they don't really evaluate them at this point, and yet they're making a recommendation. The same thing happens with trees. When the Planning Commission gets their backup for zoning, they get a line on trees. Usually says no trees are affected, and then there's 5 or 6 heritage trees there because the survey is not done until later. But once the zoning is changed, the fate of those trees is sealed. So, the community effort, all these neighbors that have worked so hard for so many years, to say that this doesn't represent the rest of that neighborhood, they have a petition with the minimum number required and even more. Who are these neighbors that are not protecting this when those people that live within a certain distance from the land have signed the petition? What are we talking about here? So I ask you to please consider this and consider changing the system because all of this is upside down.